denying low-skilled migrant visas. Immigration revolution is how the Daily Mail sums it up, which covers the same story. The Eye leads on the new proposed points-based immigration system too, which would also mean no access to benefits for those coming to the UK for the first 5 years. The Australian-style system will bar non-English speakers, according to The Guardian. Meanwhile, the Financial Times reports that with the threat of coronavirus looming, Jaguar Land Rover has taken the extraordinary step of flying car parts out of China in suitcases in order to head off possible plant closures in the UK. The Daily Telegraph says Lord Steele could face expulsion from the Liberal Democrats as he's expected to be singled out for censure by the National Child Sex Abuse Inquiry for failing to pass on his suspicions about Cyril Smith. And a convicted killer with no history of extremism launched a copycat jihadist attack on prison staff last week. That is the lead for The Times. So Jenny Kleeman and Mark Wallace is here. A story that is just breaking, just unfolding, is the immigration revolution, as the Daily Mail puts it. This points-based system, if that's the best way to describe it. I know the opposition have some quibbles with that, but tell us first of all what it involves.
Well, the first thing it involves is, for the first time in over 45 years, an elected government of the United Kingdom is setting a universal UK immigration policy. And that's what taking back control was meant to mean, regardless actually of what particular policy it might happen to be. The whole point is we actually get to our own parliament and government to decide this. We get to debate it, and it's actually something you can change democratically at the next election. So as a Leave voter, I'm glad to see these powers being repatriated to the UK and then actually used. What they're actually proposing to do is, in some ways, bits of the system are going to loosen. Skilled workers, there's going to be no cap. And now, for example, in other parts of the system, this points-based element and salary cap, there's going to be a tightening, particularly for low-skilled migrants from the EU.
Yes, points for speaking English, points for having a salary over 25,000.
This is inside the pages of the Daily Mail, so let's see if we can see that as well, yeah.
Lots of opportunities for points. Not a lot of explanation of how we are going to be able to keep care homes staffed. What about the restaurant, hospitality sector? What about the building sector? There are exemptions for seasonal workers, for agriculture. The building sector is already suffering. My husband is a builder. I know that there is a huge lack of scarcity of labour in the building trade ever since the Brexit vote. So there's going to have to be some way of addressing that. There's an assumption that it's going to be filled with British workers, but I know that many people have been trying to recruit British workers and haven't found much luck with that. Yeah, this is what taking back control looks like, and it's at the expense of us being able to live and work in the EU states, but this is what we voted for, and it's interesting to see that this is what it's going to look like. If you are wealthy and very, very qualified with a PhD in science, technology, engineering and maths, it will almost be impossible for you to be not allowed into the country. However, this country relies on migrant labour to make many parts of it work.
So how much of this is reliant on the idea of, let's, for example, say the Polish bomber, who it was deemed undercut British workers, sent money back home with a high pound. The differentials in wages were such that that was profitable to do. Obviously, the pound has subsequently fallen and many Poles have gone back home. But apart from that, how much of this policy is driven by that thought, that that is partly what drove the Brexit vote?
Well, I think it's definitely the case that there are a decent number of people in this country who are frustrated and concerned about the very concept of not being able to decide what immigration policy would be at all, regardless. And actually, it's interesting, since the referendum, we've seen levels of public opposition to immigration fall in just about every opinion poll, partially because one of the things people were annoyed about was just not being able to decide. If somebody else decides something for you, you tend to be much more critical of their decision than actually a decision that you feel you've got some say into your vote.
Well, nothing to do with the Syrian migrant crisis being further away now. The march across Europe was not.
The UK concern about migration fell even when the Syrian migrant crisis was still underway. But it's also the case that when you talk about things like wages and so on, it may well be challenging, I think, for parts of the UK economy to have a change in the supply of cheaper labour from the EU. However, for an understandable number of voters in the UK, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Remember, during the referendum campaign, Stuart Rose, who was the head of the campaign, went for a parliamentary committee and said, well, one very concerning idea about getting rid of free movement would be that we'd have to raise people's wages. Well, to a lot of voters, that didn't sound like a bad idea.
Yeah, but the thing is about raising people's wages is that means we also have to be prepared to pay more for things, which may be a good idea, but I think people might find it difficult to be expected to pay more tax for the care system, to pay more for building projects, to pay more for the coffees that people in cafes are making it for them.
Or maybe we should have an education system that focuses on educating people in the UK and make sure they actually leave school, leave the education system with skills to go into work,
Yeah,
and helping to
do those jobs. We still need people to work on building sites and to work in cafes and to work in the hospitality industry.
I mean, the point you're making, we are an advanced economy. There comes a point where perhaps Brits don't want to do those jobs. Is that something that is of concern to government, or do they think that the UK will
Of course, it's
adapt?
something the government's going to have to pay attention to. And also, it's worth noting this isn't a system that's like this is what they're going to do and it's never ever going to be changeable at all. Part of the purpose of this, when you look at, say, what you mentioned, the large increase, the quadrupling of the visa availability for seasonal agricultural workers, for example, somewhere where, as you say, there's been a demonstrable problem of people not wanting to do seasonal harvesting work, not simply workers not being available to do it, where they're quadrupling the allowance for workers under that scheme. That's an example of what I suspect they'll do in various other places over time as things
Well,
change.
this is what they'll have to do because there are entire sectors of industry that are dependent on this kind of labour.
Sure, but
it's not accounted for in these plans.
But what alternative? Well, it is accounted for in these plans because that's precisely what things like Migration Advisory Committee is there for. That's why they're talking about.
I wish there was more detail on because I do think we need to think this through, like who is going to look after old people in care homes, what is going to happen to the building industry.
But presumably, the focus will be on how fleet of foot this system is, how quickly you can adapt it, how much you can suddenly change the policy. I mean, people with PhDs do really rather well, don't they? Even though they're in education for a very long time, some of them, has to be said.
Yes, and particularly PhDs in science, technology, engineering, and maths.
But that's precisely what we're talking about. You're talking about areas where it's felt that the UK economy has shortages of people in particular areas. That's one example.
And that's the sort of economy they want.
Yes, but you still need all the support people who are going to hand those people the scalpel or whatever,
But when does the time come when people are actually willing to accept that simply saying it's a solution to have free movement of people, to skim over issues about employability and work rates in parts of the UK economy, and to actually, in some cases, frankly, allow some businesses to be subsidised through cheap migrant labour and the welfare system for in-work benefits. Those things are interrelated. Some of those other issues need to be solved as well.
Absolutely,
but I don't think it was a sustainable solution anymore just to say free movement of people, specifically from the EU only, and it resolves these things. We don't need to.
Let's just see the papers before you have a thought. I can see it forming there. The UK closes the door to low-skilled migrant workers. Is their take on this story? A new points-based immigration system revealed to the world. Job offer essential except for the highest qualified migrants, as we've been saying. The Metro also ban on cheap EU workers. Patel is out to stop low-skilled migration, but unions warn of a care crisis, which is the point that you're making. And then The Guardian as well fears for the UK economy as Johnson closes the border to unskilled workers. We've had a lot of response from the opposition already to this. Diane Abbott, still Shadow Home Secretary, suggesting that this isn't an Australian points-based system, which is a meaningless government soundbite. It is a salary threshold system, which will need to have so many exemptions for the NHS, for social care, and for many parts of the private sector that it will be meaningless.
I mean, not as meaningless as that quote. There's the problem that actually it doesn't seem that the Labour Party know what they want in either direction. You can criticise this in various different ways. Jenny's criticism of it is perfectly cogent and coherent. It might not be one that necessarily everybody shares, but the Labour Party's criticism of it is, oh, well, this isn't really strict. It's also a bit too strict. It's not a point system. It is a point system, and it won't work anyway. I mean, the problem is the Labour Party Party does not know what it wants. It knows that a lot of its voters, in its heart of hearts, it knows that a lot of its voters are very, very unhappy. Former voters, very, very unhappy. But you look at the leadership candidates. You'll see this in Sky's debate as well with the leadership candidates on the 27th. They themselves are not willing to come out and admit that their voters have decided there's a problem.
Well, the Liberal Democrat Home Affairs spokeswoman Christine Jardine almost goes further, saying that the proposals were based on xenophobia and not the social and economic needs of our country. Too many businesses are already struggling to hire the workers they need, and now the Tories want to stop them recruiting all but the highest paid employees from abroad. There's been a lot of question, hasn't there, about the threshold, the salary threshold that's been mooted as part of these plans.
Yes, I mean, we need to think about is this an arbitrary, where does this come from? I'm sure it comes from, a lot of thought, I hope, a lot of thought has gone into it. I don't know whether or not it's fair to call all of this xenophobia. I think that's overly simplistic, as much as the Labour Party's response is very vague. I think there are really legitimate questions here, which is how are we going to fund our economy when there are lots of jobs that currently don't have high salaries, that a lot of British people don't want to take, and if we're going to increase those salaries, then we need to be prepared to pay more. It's something we all need to think about, what kind of society we want to live in. That's the point.
That idea of actually having a one universal worldwide applicable immigration policy as being xenophobic is beyond parity. The fact is that there'll be quite a lot of people watching tonight who've come to the UK from countries outside the EU who've gone through very strict restrictions, including things like salary limits in migration processes, already to get to the UK, while EU citizens have had access to free movement. It's never really been adequately explained to a lot of those people why, if you're not from the EU, you should have one system. If you're in the EU,
because it was a reciprocal thing. We could go and work in other EU countries. I mean, that's
but I think no, that's just a description of what it was. It's never a good explanation, I think, for example, to a lot of Commonwealth citizens, why actually for the UK, as far as the UK was concerned, the UK was willing to snub our historic relations with the Commonwealth and say actually the EU citizens will get priority and open access, and you won't.
But there was a very
This is going to be one system that applies to anyone from around the world. In that, it's equitable, which I think is an improvement.
Yeah, let's just go back to the Mail double page spread, which has got the most detail so far,
Yes.
hasn't it, on it? In terms of the idea of free movement, what does this mean in terms of reciprocal dealings for all those Brits who are abroad at the moment who want to go and live and work in Spain and places like that? What will the EU do about it?
I think the current system is that anybody who is already in the UK and anybody who is already abroad, it's not going to apply to them.
I think settled status
Yes,
or whatever. But in the future, if you want to go and work in a bar in Mallorca or whatever it might be, will you also have to be tested in this way, or will we wait to see what each individual country does?
Well, it'll partially depend on what policy the EU decides to settle on. I suspect it may be also something that relates to some of the question of future relationship negotiations, or at least policy setting. I suspect you may hear some grumpy noises from the EU Commission as part of this negotiation as the year goes on. This might come into play. The fact is that the EU is either going to be one of two things. Either it's going to be what it says it is, which is something that puts the economies of its member states first, in which case it seems very unlikely they're going to start saying, for example, that large numbers of UK retirees to Spain and Portugal who bring large amounts of money with them should be turfed out in some way. Or it's going to be what it says it isn't, which is damaging to its member states by and politically jealous towards its neighbours and very restrictive. I suspect it'll turn out to be the former, because ultimately they may like to wave the banner, but actually they're quite pragmatic.
But it's certainly dominating the front pages for tomorrow. You can see Priti Patel there in the paper inside the Mail. She will also be on Kay Burley at breakfast. That is at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. So Kay Burley interviewing the Home Secretary tomorrow. Well, plenty more still to come this evening here on the press preview, including car parts in suitcases, how Jaguar Land Rover is trying to protect its UK business from the effects of coronavirus. Back with that in just a moment. Watching the press preview with me this evening, Jenny Kleeman and Mark Wallace. Welcome back to both of you. So coronavirus impact not only in China but elsewhere as well. We heard today from Jaguar Land Rover, to the point where they've had to bring small parts back in suitcases to keep the operation going. It's extraordinary.
Indeed, and we all know conceptually that huge quantities of literally everything are made in China. But if you think about the multiple levels of impact of the coronavirus within China itself, Obviously, there are people who are directly affected. There are people living very near to those who are directly affected. There are businesses and state agencies that are trying to keep people away, keep staff away from each other, keep them at home, close down operations in order to try and avoid infection. There's what's reported to be the largest control of movement of people in human history in terms of the number of cities, tens of millions of people in lockdown. All of that has knock-on effects in what's effectively become the world's factory. And
Well, Apple phones, for example. I mean, you know,
Apple phones,
and
Jaguar Land Rover parts, where they say that
Samsung, Chrysler, all, the detail in this is, and even in things that, you may not know this, but I have a book coming out in July.
Really?
Apparently so,
You should
so my
mention it
publishers tell me.
more.
And in the world of publishing, because books are generally all printed in China, and in the world of publishing has been affected by the coronavirus, because things not being able to come away from China. So everything is not just the sort of the parts that you would expect, the sort of car parts, but so much of the world, as you say, it's the world's factory. Everyone depends on China, and it's either things aren't being made or they can't get out. It's chaotic.
We've seen some reports of the raw materials for pharmaceuticals. Something like 80% of the raw materials for pharmaceuticals that we end up using are manufactured in China.
battery parts.
Well, what happens if God forbid, coronavirus really spreads at an alarming rate in this country, for example, and people will inevitably, I suspect, go out trying to buy face masks and so on. Where are face masks made? Well, they're made largely in China.
Yes.
All of these knock-on effects, we know conceptually that the world is more interconnected than ever before. But actually, when you see this major economy in large parts shut down or slow down, that has a short-term effect like this. It's going to have a longer-term effect of a more general global economic impact.
Some people will see what Mr. Trump is going on about, perhaps, when we hear talk like that. And suggestion last week: if there's a run on face masks, you won't get any dental services,
Yes.
will you? It's interesting. Anyway, let's go on to the Elgin Marbles, which everybody's denying is a case. This Elgin Marbles clause. Some people will never have heard of the Elgin Marbles. Do you want to explain?
Well, I mean, I feel that maybe Mark should explain this, because this combines two of Mark's great passions, which is the EU and archaeology.
I've lost
Greek treasures that were taken by Lord Elgin in the 19th century to the British Museum, where they are available for people around the world to see for free. However, we probably shouldn't have them. And we probably won't have them forever, because the justification for us being able to keep these national treasures of other countries well, we're very good at looking after them, and perhaps you won't be so good. And ultimately, that's kind of unsustainable. But the idea is, in these trade negotiations, there is a clause that might mean the repatriation of the Elgin Marbles. Apparently, this clause is actually there to stop looting. London is also a centre of looting and of antiquities, which have been used to fund terrorism in the past, so it's a serious deal. But again, this story is going to keep coming up.
Even the Greeks have denied it's all about the Elgin Marbles.
Yeah, which is a sign that it's blatantly all about the Elgin Marbles. But you can get into a real tit for tat about this if you want. I mean, apparently, Italy reportedly supported Greece having this clause installed. The Italians need to be very careful. The Roman writer Tacitus was very loose-lipped. He was very loose-lipped when he wrote about the things that the Romans took from Britain. They liked the tin, the slaves, the hunting dogs. We want them all back. We should ask Italy to hand back all the tin that they mined out 1800 years ago, and return that if they want the Elgin Marbles.
Very interesting. Okay, so just quickly, give us a little help, Boris. This is in the Metro.
Yes, it's that whole question of why isn't Boris going and visiting these places? He probably should. But that's not why we picked this, is it, Mark?
Yeah, if you look at the bottom right of the page, the one thing more ridiculous than giving human names to storms is spotting faces in things. I love it when people say, I've spotted Cliff Richard in avocado, I've seen the Virgin Mary in somebody's fence post, and now they've spotted allegedly a witch's face in a giant way.
It's a profile. I've now got it.
It looks
Yeah,
a lot,
it took me
it looks
a
a
while
lot,
to get
a lot more like
Actually looks like a US president.
or Ronnie Wood
Yeah.
at the Brit Awards.
So you're now taking part in what you've just criticised, but there we are. More on that, and serious look at the flooding later as well too, and the weather. I'm afraid more rain on the way. We'll see you at 11:30. We'll have the sport. An agonising night for Liverpool in the Champions League has left them with work to do against Atletico Madrid in the second leg.
On the red carpet, he'd worn a black ribbon, the tribute to ex-girlfriend Caroline Flack. On stage, clearly emotional, the lyrics to Harry Styles' song Falling took on a new meaning.
And I can't take it back, I can't unpack the baggage left.
The former Love Island presenter's death was referenced from the start.
She was a kind and vibrant person with an infectious sense of fun. She will...
She's home watching. Thank you.
For the Daily Mail, which covered. Now you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour, then, we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Jenny Kleeman and the chief executive of Conservative Home, Mark Wallace. Great to see you both. Hello to you. So as ever, let's check out the front pages. The Metro leads on the Home Secretary Priti Patel planning to.
Well, he will.
The Daily Express splashing with the same story and has the headline Unveiled Historic New Border Controls. Meanwhile, the Daily Mirror reporting on the flood-hit parts of the country and warnings as conditions are set to worsen once again. The Financial Times reporting that with the threat of coronavirus, saying that beer goggles really do. With just one alcoholic drink able to make men appear more attractive. Is that a scientific study or something? I'm
It
not
must
sure.
be. It's on the front of the Daily Star.
Star,
Okay,
so-
only it's next only to the New Scientist. It's academic rigor.
So Jenny and Mark are here. Right, okay. It is the immigration revolution, depending what paper you take.
Simply not personally, primarily because of concern, in my case, about immigration, but because I wanted to see our laws and our policies set democratically in this country. This is what all of us who voted